The spy cables. Al Jazeera's investigative unit releases hundreds of secret intelligence documents. From Israel's Mossad, Britain's MI6, Russia's FSB and others. Today, we examine the impact of the biggest intelligence leak since Snowden on global espionage and South Africa's relations with the outside world. Hello from me, David Foster. Welcome to the Spy Cables Decoded. Well, in the second of two programs, we consider the international impact of Al Jazeera's release of those hundreds of classified documents ranging from confidential to top secret. The widest-ranging leak of intelligence papers ever. What do they tell us about how intelligence agencies communicate with one another, and what effect will the leak have on international relations? It made headlines the world over and was described as massive and unprecedented in newspapers as far afield as China and South America. Evidence that Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu misled the United Nations topped news in numerous countries. The CIA's desire to talk to Hamas, snooping on the head of Greenpeace, a plot to kill the head of the African Union, all grabbed global attention. The hashtag Spy Cables sparked a lively discussion, especially in South Africa, where the cables led the trends on Twitter. And I'm joined from Johannesburg by Andre Roux, a former South African intelligence officer, a spy, now at the Institute of Studies. In the studio, we have Andrew Feinstein, a former South African MP. His revelations about a corrupt arms deal led to the end of his political career. He is the author of The Shadow World, about the arms trade and intelligence organizations. And we have with us also Clayton Swisher, the head of the investigative unit here at Al Jazeera, which obtained and published the spy cables. Well, before we go any further, let us start with our first report. One of the themes running through the spy cables is that politicians often tell their public the direct opposite of the information that their intelligence agencies are giving them. You'll hear from Clayton in just a moment, his thoughts then, but first, here's his report.
This is a bomb. This is a fuse.
It's now notorious. The moment Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu warned the United Nations of an Iranian nuclear bomb. The imagery was simplistic, and so was the message.
By next spring, at most by next summer, at current enrichment rates, they will have finished the medium enrichment and move on to the final stage.
The spy cables revealed that behind the scenes, just 1 month after the speech, Israeli intelligence sent a very different message. This is a secret Mossad analysis dated October 2012.
Iran at this stage is not performing the activity necessary to produce weapons.
Thank you.
The spy cable shed a new light on Netanyahu's UN address and begs the question, where did he get this information? UNESCO gave the State of Palestine full membership in 2011, and its president, Mahmoud Abbas, has sought wider UN recognition ever since. But the cables illustrate how the Americans and Israelis fight that policy to the highest levels. One 2012 cable reveals a secret phone call from the White House to the Palestinian Authority leader. President Obama threatened President Abbas if he went ahead with the UN bid. It now emerges they were seeking to establish contact with Hamas, a group it considers a terrorist organization. A secret cable reveals a CIA operative in East Jerusalem asked his South African counterpart to put them in touch. The South African writes that the CIA seems desperate to make inroads into Hamas in Gaza. He recommends they help. By doing so, South Africa will stand the chance of benefiting from the interaction in that we would establish the collection priorities and requirements of the CIA. So in other words, they would know what the CIA is up to. Meanwhile, in 2009, South Africa's spy chief gets a direct phone call from Mossad boss Meir Dagan. Mossad wants South Africa to vote down the Goldstone report, a UN fact-finding mission after the 2009 Gaza war. The report said Israel had committed numerous war crimes. According to Mossad's top man, Mahmoud Abbas felt voting in favor of the Goldstone report would play into the hands of rivals Hamas and weaken his position. In this way, the cables reveal how the US, Israel, and Palestinian Authority are privately forming clandestine alliances they would never admit to in public.
Andrew Feinstein, we will begin with you. The US talks to Hamas when it says it isn't talking to Hamas. The Israeli Prime Minister says there's going to be an Iranian nuclear bomb when his spies are telling him there isn't going to be a nuclear bomb. Two questions in one here. What difference does it make that they're not telling the truth? And by extension, what difference does it make that we now know that?
In terms of what difference it makes, some of these decisions are matters of life and death. We recall Colin Powell's speech to the UN that presaged the invasion of Iraq. Benjamin Netanyahu has a very clear political agenda to, as far as possible, cripple Iran. To appear at the UN, make pronouncements to the world that his own intelligence agency are saying don't bear scrutiny, has huge consequences for Iran, for the whole region, for Israel, the United States of America, etc. So I think these things do have great importance. In terms of what it means that we now know, I think what it means is that we have to be very cautious about what we accept from politicians. If somebody is painted as a country's archenemy, but there are all sorts of talks, negotiations, or if we think back to the Iran-Contra imbroglio of a few decades ago, a whole illicit foreign policy initiative that was taking place. I think these do have consequences for the countries, for its citizens, and for millions of people around the world.
Let's go to South Africa. Andre Roux, you've been on the end of providing the sort of information that we're talking about here as an intelligence officer. A, does it surprise you that we now are talking about the fact that politicians and their spy agencies don't necessarily come out with the same lines? And secondly, in your experience, did it happen quite often?
Well, having focused on the military intelligence aspects more on the operational level, there's a difference between that and your strategic intelligence level with national security threats. But there is a fine line between public management or management of public perceptions, which politicians are into, and actually telling the truth. If you just take Netanyahu's statement to the UN, he was saying, yes, 70% in terms of enrichment, and then there's the 20% component of enriching that further. But what he left out is that there is quite a large scope between having fissile nuclear material and having the fusion systems, the delivery systems, the warheads and that type of thing, which could take many years, and is normally the biggest impediment to actually having nuclear weapon delivery capability.
Andre, thanks very much indeed. Clayton Swisher, head of our investigative unit. You were the guys that put all this information out there. It's now being suggested that South African spies are having to be withdrawn from their posts, even though you redacted some of the names. It's been suggested that groups such as Al-Qaeda will now be able to look at these cables or what we've put out about them and say, OK, now they know this about us. There's a danger here, isn't there?
Well, we take that one by one. The editorial process of deciding what to publish and what to withhold was editorially torturous. It was very time-consuming in terms of redactions. And our guiding philosophy, sorry to say to some of our critics, wasn't the advancement of the careers of spies, but rather how would the publication of these documents affect potentially unwitting people who over the years had met with people they had no idea were spies. And we're talking, there's a lot of undemocratic regimes out there that would not take kindly to finding out that so-and-so was meeting with someone they thought was a banker who in fact was an undercover Russian officer or an undercover South African officer or an undercover Mossad officer. So we went through and we took away the names of mid and low-level intelligence operatives for that reason, because we don't want to do harm to average citizens To the point of al-Qaeda, this is a refrain that is commonly used by security services. Going back to WikiLeaks, going back to Edward Snowden's disclosure, there is zero evidence that this has given anyone a leg up in
But if you tell them something about what you know about them, they know more than they did before.
Al-Qaeda, there's much more evidence that Al-Qaeda knows that they've been listened into even before Edward Snowden. There's no empirical data. This is a justification that is used by those security services to continue keeping everything they do beyond public scrutiny. So when someone actually shows, evidence of this, I would be happy to respond to it.
Clayton, thanks very much indeed. Andrew Feinstein, the suggestion is that it's better that people know that they're being spied on and by whom they're being spied upon. There's a danger with that, is that you're not spying if you tell somebody.
Of course you're not. And that does have some national security implications. But this whole arena is constantly a trade-off, a balancing act between the legitimate needs for national security and the reality that we, as citizens and citizens all around the world, have certain rights, certain civil rights, certain privacy rights. And it's crucial that we find the appropriate balance between that. Now, unfortunately, I have discovered in the work that I do into the global arms trade that the veil of secrecy around national security not only conceals quite legitimate national security issues, but that there's a whole panoply of other information that is hidden by that secrecy, some of it concealing criminal behavior by politicians, senior businessmen, spies, and arms dealers.
So, Andre Roux, the justification to some extent is that a lot of what's going on is understandably nefarious, but it is exposing the real wrongdoings that are being committed here.
Well, there is definitely a lot of public interest in South Africa, specifically over this right to know or what is in public interest. As soon as you have illegal activities, corruption, intelligence resources being used for political objectives, then you definitely have a right for the public to know about it. And with the government proposing the secrecy bill, which is draconian in terms of it will be illegal if information has been classified by a government agency to have possession of that either as a private citizen or as a media outlet and to publish it. So this will really close the democratic space quite dramatically.
Is there a but
if
here?
you look on the other hand,
I didn't say, maybe you're getting onto it,
Yeah.
sorry for interrupting. Is it, on the other hand, it's all right for people to
Yes.
know, they should know, but there are times when they shouldn't?
Very, very much so. The main challenge with these disclosures and the intercepts that the State Security Agency is going to be facing is that a lot of their focus, while they do have SIGINT electronic interception capability, and they do that, but a lot of it is based on human intelligence collection. Now, if you have an informant that is able to provide you with some classified secret information, whether about a terrorist activity or whatever, the first question they ask is, can you keep a secret? I'm trusting my life in your hands. Apart from the motives for them giving this information. So now with confidence being seriously eroded with these leaks, it will dent quite severely the State Security Agency's ability to actually get information from other intelligence organizations.
Andre, I'm going to come back to you in a little while because we will talk more about the secrecy bill. I'd like to move on to another element of our show at the moment. One of the other themes emerging from the cables is that South Africa's spy organisation, we've referred to it many times, the State Security Agency, is being asked by Western agencies as well as by Israel to do their bidding, despite South Africa's prominent role in the non-aligned movement. Well, as the West tries to reach a deal with Iran on its nuclear program, as we've been hearing, the cables reveal secret US efforts to elicit South Africa's help. Here's Phil Rees.
South African spies have been watching the Iranian embassy closely. They have compiled a detailed list of its current and former staff, regular visitors, even the gardeners. South Africa's secret report says Iran is working to beat sanctions and is buying materials to make weapons. The British think so too. A 2009 MI6 cable warns of a front company for the production of missile launchers and rocket bodies. It highlights an upcoming business trip to Iran by a dual UK-South African citizen.
We would be grateful for any action you may be able to take under your export licensing laws to prevent the proposed visits going ahead.
South Africa's spies see carpet shops, news agencies and airlines as fronts for Iranian intelligence. Throughout the spy cables, we see intelligence agencies hunting their great enemy, Al-Qaeda. The State Security Agency has identified individuals it says are linked to Al-Qaeda and spent time in South Africa. Barry Gilder is a former intelligence coordinator and spy chief. He says the West pressured South Africa to hunt for Al-Qaeda, but the threat was low.
At the time I was in government, our assessment was that we didn't see Al-Qaeda as a particular threat in South Africa, although we kept a watching brief.
The spy cable suggests governments don't just communicate genuine security threats, but also further their own foreign policies by exploiting every country's fear of attack. The spy cables give a glimpse into how intelligence agencies hunt for information and who they choose as targets. There are the usual suspects, but also the less publicized, such as environmental group Greenpeace. A confidential document from 2010 shows how, in the run-up to the G20 summit in South Korea, spies in Seoul asked for specific security assessments on the head of Greenpeace, Kumi Naidu, and 2 other South Africans listed as dangerous persons.
Sadly, the assumption that we make, especially after the Edward Snowden leaks and the WikiLeaks information came out, that in fact we are heavily monitored and are being under constant surveillance.
Okay, Andrew Feinstein still with us in the studio. We hear some serious allegations there. Also, we've also heard that Algeria, for one country, wanted the parking restrictions lifted outside its embassy. There's from the sublime to the ridiculous. And what I'm wondering here is, have we had a glimpse of a world where everybody helps everybody else, obviously to their own advantage? Or are we seeing South Africa specifically as a poodle to outside interests?
At some level, everybody helps everybody else where they have common cause. The problem is that when you're in this world of deception and intrigue, you're not quite sure whether somebody is actually helping you or simply furthering their own aims. And part of the problem is if you don't have appropriate accountability, appropriate oversight, and basic efficiencies, you're going to develop problems like this, as we've seen in the South African case. Now, the other difficulty that we must highlight is that the deceit and intrigue is used to survey all sorts of people, some of whom could never be conceived by anybody as a terrorist threat. We saw the example there of Kumi Naidu. The British Intelligence Service's GCHQ has been illegally surveying people, including journalists, intercepting their communications, illegally intercepting communications between lawyers and their clients. And you've got to ask yourself, where is the balance here? Where is the accountability? Where is the meaningful oversight?
OK, let's go to Clayton. If there is no accountability generally, do we have to provide that? Is that a journalist's job?
Well, I was very pleased, and I know the rest of my journalistic colleagues were as well, to see that the debate that this has sparked, not just globally with respect to Iran and Israel's warmongering prime minister, but with respect to civil liberties and the appropriate role of oversight in South Africa. We saw in the cables that there are a number of Muslim groups in that country that have fallen under the suspicion of the government merely because of outside pressure. This whole post 9/11 war on terror. These Islamic groups, you talk with anyone there, security experts included, who are South African, they would say these guys are harmless, they can't bust a grape in a food fight, there's no threat. But because of Western intelligence pressure, nonetheless, they're surveilled. So these are issues that South Africans should be talking about. Why are we wasting resources, time, and energy? Not to mention the loss of their privacy, because outside powers see Muslims as a threat.
Andre Roux, you've been listening to that. You're in Johannesburg. You know that we broke this story in line with the Guardian newspaper in Britain, and this is one thing it wrote. In the world of espionage today, as in the past, spies peppering reports with half-truths, rumours, the outlandish and the downright ridiculous is par for the course, and it likens it to Graham Greene's Our Man in Havana. Is the South African Security Agency merely doing more or less competently what it's supposed to do, protecting national security? It's simply that we've seen it in a slightly ridiculous light.
Well, I think in the intelligence game, you have a lot of similarities around the world. One of the challenges that an international or a national security agency will have is always that you get fishing expeditions from other countries' intelligence organizations, where they have a suspicion or a fear. They will then send you possibly an intelligence requirement based on an allegation. For instance, there are terrorist training camps in your country for Tamil Tigers. And now you have to throw resources at it because you have never access to the origin of the information. Is it credible threat? Is it a credible source? And so this is how the game is played internationally. I think in terms of the way they are doing business, they have a lot of competency and ability. But a lot of activities within the intelligence environment are very mundane and routine because you're looking at aspects, everything from human security, economical aspects that affect your country, influencing weapons sales, whatever it is. And the pure actual national security threats are very small percentage of the actual activities that they do. But certainly these cables do give quite a negative view sometimes of the activities that are being conducted.
Clayton Swisher, when Benjamin Netanyahu goes to the United States shortly before the Israeli general election, are you expecting people to make capital out of what Al Jazeera has published here?
Well, I think it has compounded the growing debate. First, it was based on form. Prime Minister Netanyahu was not invited by the White House. He was invited by members of the Republican Party to give this joint address before the Congress. So it was very much seen as a slight against President Obama and Democrats. But it has now have gone from superficial to actual substance. What the Prime Minister told the world in 2012 was questionable at best, and now with the revelation of this top secret Mossad document in the spy cables, there's no conceivable basis for people to believe Prime Minister Netanyahu when he speaks before the Congress next week. And so now it's not one of trivial, did he get invited here in the proper way, but whether there should be any basis that the Congress or the public should believe this man on a matter of war and peace.
And Andrew Feinstein, as a former South African MP, deeply involved with the ANC, do you believe this assessment, which has been out there in a number of publications this week, that while the Netanyahu story may well grab the headlines, that the biggest impact of this is going to be domestically in South Africa?
I think the impact has already been and will continue to be both domestic and international. I think that what we are seeing at both levels is the penchant of politicians to evoke fear wherever possible because it plays well with voters. There is another dimension to it as well, and that's the economic dimension. The more you can escalate fears, threats, the more billions of dollars are being spent on weaponry, on spying equipment, etc., etc., and unfortunately many people gain from that. I think that what South Africans want to see are honest, accountable politicians. And I think that these revelations are again going to undermine the status of their politicians and intelligence
services. And Andre
services.
Roux, in Johannesburg, are you going to get honest, accountable politicians if, as some have suggested, this pressures the SSA to make sure that it's brought into law, the secrecy bill?
Well, I think that it's going to be more difficult to have the insight, have the public access and the right to know kind of trend within the media and with whistleblowers as a result of a fallout of this, with a tightening up of secrecy. As it is, we have a lot of problems with our Joint Intelligence Oversight Committee, not, in my opinion, doing a really good job the last few years. So there is a lot of secrecy, a lot of activity which is not in the public domain, which possibly should be. I disagree with the issue of, operational information being disclosed and the techniques of what you do and how you do. But definitely from the oversight and the accountability, there is a lot more needed. Will this impact on having better politicians? I don't think it will at the end of the day.
Andre, thank you very much indeed. That is the Spy Cables Decoded. Thank you for watching. Thank you to all of our guests. Andre Roux, we just heard from him, to Andrew Feinstein and Clayton Swisher for taking part in this discussion. We understand a few more papers may well be released, but not for a while. So for now, it's goodbye from me, David Foster, from the entire team who put this programme together, and from all of us here on the Spy Cables team. Good to have your company. Bye-bye.